At 15, I watched my grandfather die, betrayed by a lifelong friend who stole everything. 13 years later, now a lawyer, I walked into court with a plan, evidence, and a promise to keep. This isn't just revenge. It's justice, delivered cold and calculated. You won't believe how it ends. Welcome to Burnt Bridges Revenge, the home of true tales where betrayal meets cold, calculated justice. If you're someone who believes that silence isn't weakness and that the best revenge is served with proof, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear will stay with you long after the final word. Now, let's begin. I was just 15 when I sat beside my grandfather's hospital bed, watching the beeping machines do the talking he no longer could. He was a proud man, the kind who built things with his hands and never asked for help, even when arthritis made his fingers swell like overripe fruit. That day, though, I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before: shame. Not for the cancer eating him up, but for the way his so-called best friend, Walter Hensley, had taken everything from him. I remember gripping his wrinkled hand, trembling and cold, and whispering, "I'll make it right, Grandpa. I swear." He blinked, slow and heavy, and that was the last movement he made before the long, steady beep filled the room. That moment carved a scar into my soul, not from grief alone, but from the quiet fury I buried that day. You see, Walter wasn't just a friend. He was my grandfather's business partner for over 30 years. Together they ran a small-town equipment repair shop, a place every farmer for 50 miles relied on. But when Grandpa started getting sick, Walter started getting greedy. First, he took over the finances. Then, he manipulated my grandmother, sweet and trusting, to sign away parts of the business. And when Grandpa was too weak to stand, Walter moved in like a vulture, transferring ownership of the shop, the land, and even their home to his own name. No lawyers, no notice. Just fraud disguised as friendship. My family didn't find out until weeks after the funeral. Walter had already listed the house for sale. I watched my mother cry, packing boxes in silence, her hands shaking with disbelief. That house had been in our family for generations. It felt like losing Grandpa twice. I didn't tell anyone what I planned to do. I was just a kid, and no one would have taken me seriously. But that promise, it lived inside me, louder with every year. I read everything I could about contracts, fraud, real estate law. I spent nights watching legal breakdowns on YouTube while my classmates were obsessed with games and dating. I worked my way through community college, then law school, fueled by a fire no one else could see. Every paper I wrote, every case I studied, I imagined Walter on the other side of the table. I didn't just want revenge, I wanted it airtight, legal, permanent. I wanted the man who stole my grandfather's legacy to watch it crumble in his own hands. By the time I was 28, I had my license, a small but growing client base, and something Walter never saw coming: leverage. Over the years, I had quietly collected every scrap of paperwork from Grandpa's old files, documents Walter had been too arrogant to destroy. The signature mismatches, the forged notary stamps, the falsified land transfers. It was all there, buried in a box my aunt had nearly thrown away during the move. But more importantly, I'd made connections. One of my old professors now worked in the county recorder's office. A college roommate was an up-and-coming state prosecutor. Piece by piece, I assembled my chessboard. I just needed the right moment to make the first move. That moment came in the form of a phone call. A local real estate agent contacted me to handle a land dispute. The client? Walter Hensley. He didn't recognize my name. Too many years had passed, and I never used my grandfather's last name professionally. But the moment I walked into that office and saw his face, the years collapsed. His skin was loose now, eyes duller, but that same smug look still clung to him like a stain. He extended his hand, clueless, and said, "Glad you could make it." I shook it. Firm. Steady. "The pleasure's all mine, Mr. Hensley." What he didn't know was that his downfall had just stepped into the room. Walter sat across from me, legs crossed, flipping through a stack of paperwork he barely understood. He talked like he always had the upper hand, like his words still carried weight in this town. I listened politely, nodding, asking just enough questions to keep him relaxed. I needed him to believe I was just another small-time lawyer hungry for a paycheck. He handed me documents involving a dispute over the back lot of the property he'd acquired from my grandfather, now being challenged by a neighboring landowner. I smiled as I glanced at the file, but my mind wasn't on the case. It was on the seal on the land deed, the same forged seal I discovered nearly a decade ago while sorting through Grandpa's papers. Every second I spent in that room with him was both torture and fuel. This was the man who'd held my mother's tear-stained face in his hands and lied, who told us there was nothing he could do as we packed our things, who signed our family's history over to himself and walked away like it was business. He talked about zoning permits and easements like he knew what any of those words meant. He didn't. That was the thing with Walter. He was a thief, not a thinker. And I was about to turn his stolen throne into a sinking ship. Back at my office, I opened the box that had sat untouched on the top shelf of my closet for over 10 years. Every scrap of it. Photocopies of original deeds, the legitimate partnership agreement between Walter and Grandpa, time-stamped photos of equipment Grandpa paid for but Walter claimed as his. Even better, I had 2 signed affidavits, one from a former employee who had witnessed Walter coercing my grandmother into signing over the shop while she was medicated after surgery, and another from an old client who was told not to bother with the old man anymore. The pieces weren't just lining up, they were solid. All I needed now was the right sequence to burn it all down legally and leave him with no chance of appeal. Over the next 2 weeks, I played the part. I filed his land dispute like he asked. I called the county office to get updated property maps, which also let me access his public ownership filings. And that's when I found the perfect thread to pull. Walter had never updated the title insurance records after transferring the property. That meant that under certain legal conditions, the transaction could be challenged retroactively, especially if it involved fraud, which I was about to prove with surgical precision. But I didn't stop there. I contacted a local journalist I knew who was always looking for under-the-radar corruption stories. I gave her a quiet tip, a story about how a beloved community figure was scammed out of his life's work by his partner, and how his grandson, now a lawyer, was fighting to make it right. She bit hard. Within days, she had files, photos, and a scheduled interview with me, off record, for now. I wanted the court case to come first. I didn't want sympathy. I wanted facts. Then came the lawsuit. I filed under my firm's name, not mine, and attached every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every time-stamped record. The charges: fraud, unlawful property acquisition, elder financial abuse, and breach of fiduciary duty. The court accepted it within 48 hours. And just like that, Walter was being sued for everything he thought he'd gotten away with. When the summons landed on his doorstep, I got a call. I knew he'd finally read my full name on the filing. "This is personal, isn't it?" he said. His voice wasn't smug anymore. It cracked. I let the silence hang. "It's justice," I finally said. 13 years too late. What he didn't know was that this wasn't just about court. I had something else planned, something that would happen after the verdict. Something that would make the entire town remember who Walter Hensley really was. The day of the first hearing arrived like a quiet storm. I wore the same tie my grandfather wore in a photo that used to hang in the old repair shop, him shaking hands with a local farmer, both smiling, both proud. That photo was long gone, sold along with everything else. But I remembered the look on his face. It was the look of a man who built something with bare hands and a good name. Walter, on the other hand, arrived at court looking like the shell of the man I remembered. No lawyer at his side, just a worn-out suit and eyes that darted around the room like a rat sensing a flood. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. My focus was the judge, the documents, the testimony. I laid out everything, brick by brick. The original contract signed by both men in 1981, notarized and filed, the altered deed signed in shaky handwriting that didn't match my grandmother's medical records. The notarization that bore a stamp from a woman who hadn't worked at the bank in years. My witness took the stand, an old mechanic named Dell who had worked under both my grandfather and Walter. He told the court how Walter came in one day with new rules, started shutting down accounts, and told the staff that Grandpa was no longer mentally fit to manage the business. The judge's face tightened. I could tell he had seen scams before, but this was personal. Community-level betrayal has a different weight. The courtroom stayed silent except for the turning of papers and the occasional sigh from Walter's side of the bench. By the time I was done, I could see the pieces falling into place, not just legally, but morally. The judge granted us the right to proceed with asset freezing and a full audit of Walter's financial records connected to the property and business. He didn't speak when the verdict was read. He just sat there, his shoulders sinking, his lips trembling. I almost pitied him. Almost. Outside the courthouse, I stood under the same oak tree I used to climb as a kid whenever we visited Grandpa's shop. My mother was there, waiting, tears in her eyes. Not tears of grief this time, but relief, pride. She reached for my hand, but didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The moment had already spoken for itself. But the story wasn't over. I had one more move to make. The local journalist I tipped off? She had finished her piece. A week after the court date, it was front-page news in our small-town paper. Grandson of local hero exposes corruption that robbed family legacy. The story hit harder than I expected. Former clients of the repair shop started coming forward with their own stories. Complaints about Walter's behavior, unfair billing, jobs left unfinished. Even a few local officials who had looked the other way during the property transfer started panicking, realizing that their signatures might be dragged into the spotlight. And then came the letter. Mailed to my office, no return address, just my name and a neatly folded paper inside. It read, "I didn't know he did all that. I'm sorry. He fooled a lot of us." It was signed, simply, a neighbor. The town began to turn. Walter couldn't show his face without whispers following. He tried to sell his remaining assets, but the court injunction stopped him. Every dollar he made now would go toward repaying what he stole. My mother and I began the process of reclaiming the property. The house. The shop. Everything. Piece by piece, the legacy he tried to erase was rising again. But here's what hit hardest. One evening, weeks later, I drove back to the old house. It was still boarded up, the lawn overgrown. I walked to the porch, key in hand. I stood there for a long while before stepping inside. The floorboards creaked. The air was musty. But it was home. And in the center of the living room, still somehow untouched, was my grandfather's old workbench. Dusty. Scratched. Solid as ever. I ran my hand across the grain, and for the first time in years, I smiled. Would you like to conclude in Chapter 4 with the final outcome and lasting impact, or continue building with more dramatic developments? 2 months passed, but the ripples of the court case only grew louder. Walter wasn't just losing money, he was unraveling. The audit uncovered a trail of hidden bank accounts, improperly filed taxes, and misappropriated town funds tied to a local development grant he'd lobbied for years ago. Turns out, my grandfather wasn't his only victim, just his first. And now the town wanted blood. People I hadn't seen in over a decade started showing up at my office. Farmers, vendors, old shop customers. They came with stories and receipts, some yellowed and brittle from the sun, others printed from decade-old email accounts. I collected them all. Each one was a nail. I filed a class action suit on their behalf. That's when the tide became a flood. Walter tried to settle. He reached out through a new lawyer, offering a laughable sum to make the whole thing disappear quietly. I refused, not just because it was insulting, but because I knew this story had to be public. It had to live long past the verdict, because justice without memory is just a headline. The second hearing brought more than a courtroom. It brought a crowd. People filled every seat, some even standing in the aisles. The judge looked surprised when he entered. I wasn't. Small towns don't forget betrayal. They just wait for someone to light the match. Walter's lawyer argued for leniency. Age, reputation, years of service to the community. I countered with silence. Just a projector screen playing a side-by-side comparison. My grandfather's original ledger with Walter's falsified one. The judge leaned forward. The room did too. The numbers didn't lie. When the ruling came, it was brutal. Walter was ordered to repay over $800,000 across multiple plaintiffs. His properties, including the very house he stole, were seized and auctioned. But that wasn't the real sentence. The real sentence was that every person in that room saw him for who he was and would remember it. Weeks later, I walked through the now-empty repair shop with the keys back in my hand. It smelled of rust and wood and something else, something older. I stood where Grandpa used to keep his radio, dusted off the counter, and placed something on it, the original partnership agreement, framed. Beneath it, a plaque I had made. This shop was built by hands that never took more than they gave. I reopened the place, not as a business, but as a community workshop. Kids came in to learn trade skills. Old-timers came by to lend wisdom. The shop lived again, not for profit, but for purpose. And Walter? He left town. Quietly. No farewell, no buyers for his name. Last I heard, He was living off a distant cousin's grace 3 counties away. The man who once walked through these streets with pride now shuffled through them like a ghost. But I didn't gloat. I didn't smile when I heard. I simply went home, lit the porch lamp, and looked out over the land Grandpa once tilled. The promise I made as a boy was fulfilled. The man he trusted had been brought low, not with fists, but with truth. It was a Sunday evening when I finally stood alone in the backyard, just as the sun slipped below the hills my grandfather once pointed to when teaching me how to read weather patterns. I could hear the old wind chime he made from worn-out wrenches and tractor bolts, now rusted but still singing. The house, the land, the shop, they were back in the family. But it wasn't about possession anymore. It was about restoration, about truth being louder than time. That day, I hosted an open house at the shop, not to sell, but to celebrate. Folks brought stories, some brought tools, and one elderly man showed up with a faded Polaroid of Grandpa and Walter, back when things hadn't yet gone rotten. He looked at me and said, "You did what none of us had the strength to. Your grandfather would have been proud." I nodded, but inside, it hit deeper than pride. It was relief. The kind that lets you finally exhale after holding your breath for 13 years. A young boy around 10 wandered into the workroom with wide eyes and grease already smudged on his cheek. He asked if he could help rebuild the old tractor in the corner. I told him he just had to show up every weekend and ask questions. The way Grandpa let me. That's when I realized something. Revenge might have fueled me, but legacy is what would keep this place alive. That night, as the last guest left and I turned off the lights in the shop, I walked into Grandpa's old office. Everything was cleaner now, organized. His favorite chair, repaired. His calendar still hung there, frozen on the month he passed. I didn't take it down. Instead, I added one thing beside it, a picture of him and me, from when I was 12, covered in grease, holding a wrench twice too big for my hand. I wrote one word beneath it, finished. And then I closed the door. Not with anger, not with grief, but with peace, because I kept my promise. You've just heard the journey of a grandson who turned pain into purpose, who chose justice over rage and legacy over revenge. If stories of truth, resilience, and redemption move you the way this one did, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. This is just the beginning. There are more stories, real, raw, and unforgettable, waiting to be told. Join us, and let's keep these voices alive.